Oui, okay.
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining. So today, Timothée Masquelier will present. Timothée is researcher at CNRS in the lab CERCO, which is a cognitive science and computational neuroscience lab. He's in the team on neuro AI, so his work is at the interface of computational neuroscience and AI, and he's a specialist of spiking neural networks, which are interesting for low power, very fast, demanding applications. And so he will tell us about spiking neural networks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for the nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to speak at Sony CSL. So today there will be two parts in my talk. The first part is actually a course that I teach at SuperHero, and it's an introduction to spiking neural networks, because I've understood that not everyone is familiar with spiking neural networks in the audience. So it will be an introduction on spiking neural networks and how to train them. And the second part of my talk will be more my own research. Okay, so what are before I define spiking neural networks, I want to describe a bit the field of my research. I do research in two fields. First one is computational neuroscience, and the second one is neuromorphic engineering. So what is computational neuroscience? Well, there are many definitions, but there is one I like by Romain Brett. Basically, every time we perform a cognitive function, we perceive something, we make a decision, we have neurons that do some computations, and that allows this function to be performed. And what computational neuroscience seeks is a mechanistic understanding of these operations, and with a sufficient level of detail so that you can reproduce them on a computer. There is this quote that I like by Richard Feynman, who is a physicist, and he said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So it seems to be a necessary condition to be able to reproduce a mechanism to prove that you have understood it. Maybe it's not sufficient. Maybe you can reproduce things you don't fully understand, but at least it's necessary. So that's one aspect of my research. The second aspect of my research is neuromorphic engineering. So the idea is to seek for inspiration in the brain to build more intelligent machines and algorithms, or more efficient. And why it's a good idea to do that? Because we know that the brain is highly optimized by natural selection. So it has been optimized in terms of speed, robustness, in terms of energy consumption. This is maybe the most amazing feature of the brain, in my opinion. It consumes only around 20 watts. So it's not much, especially if you compare to the consumption of AI algorithms today. And it's also optimized in terms of learning, because we are able to learn from very few examples and using very few supervision. And those performances are amazing, especially because the biological hardware is quite slow and not so reliable. So if we took the same mechanisms that run on the biological hardware and we reproduced them in silicon hardware, we would be much faster than the brain and much more reliable. So there is room for improvement in changing the hardware, if you like. Okay, so now I'm going to define what are spiking neural networks, but first I'm going to contrast them with the networks that are typically used in deep learning. So this is an example of multi-layer perceptron, if you like. So you have an entry layer, you have an output layer. I guess most of this audience know this already, but between those the input layer and the output layer, you have several layers. Here it's fully connected layers, and each node here does a weighted sum of the inputs, adds a bias, passes the result into a nonlinearity function, f, and that gives the output. So what I want to stress multiple things. First, there is no dynamic here. The activations are static. They do not change through time, the xi. And second thing, the xi are real numbers. They can be, it's a graded activation. It belongs to the real number ensemble. In contrast, if we look at biological neurons, we can record their activity, and one striking feature is that they emit spikes. So what are spikes? Spikes are stereotyped electrical impulses that a neuron emits when it is sufficiently stimulated. It's an all or none phenomena. So you cannot have a neuron that emits half a spike, for instance. Either it emits a spike or it doesn't. And those spikes, they propagate along the axons. You see an example here. The axons are the cable between neurons in the brain. Then they arrive at a synapse, and they are going to be transmitted through the synapse. And each spike causes an increase of potential in the postsynaptic neuron, which is here. So here is the voltage as a function of time. So each input spike causes a jump of potential, and if you receive a sufficient number of input spikes in a sufficiently narrow time window, you have an output spike, and this output spike, the neuron will reach its threshold, and it will fire an output spike, and this output spike will impact downstream neurons. So it's important to realize that the spikes can propagate over long distances in the brain without attenuation. This is called active propagation. And the neurons can only exchange information via spikes. So for instance, there are other variables like the membrane potential, but this is a private variable. The neuron A doesn't know the potential of neuron B. What neuron A can know is if B fired or not. The spikes are the only exported information. So that being said, when you want to describe neuron activity in the brain, you have two levels of description. One is the spike-based description, which is the one I described in the previous slide. And but it's quite complicated because it's dynamic. You have different. Usually, the neuron model are defined as differential equations that you have to solve. And some people say, okay, maybe we don't need to worry about the dynamics. Maybe we can postulate that the network reaches a steady state, and then we can describe the activation of each neuron in terms of a firing rate. And if you do an approximation, so here is a simple example where I have a neuron that has n afferents here, and if we consider that all the afferents fire independently in a statistical meaning, so there is no tendency for those guys to fire together, then you can show mathematically that the firing rate of this guy is just a weighted sum of the input firing rates. That is passed into where the weights are the synaptic weights, and that is passed into a nonlinearity, which for biological neurons it has a sigmoidal shape like this. And of course, it's very tempting to adopt this formalism rather than the one on the left. Why? Because the equations are simpler. You evacuated the time. You just focus on the steady regime. So it's much simpler to simulate and to model. And also here you recognize the formalism of what we call the artificial neural networks that are used in classic deep learning. And so meaning you can use backprop and so you can train your network with backprop. So of course it's very tempting to adopt this approach. The problem is, I think, at least for computational neuroscience, if you really want to model how real neurons process information, you cannot do it because you cannot capture. If you do it, you cannot capture a key function of neurons in the brain, which is to perform coincidence detection. So this is a simple example where I have one neuron that has two afferents, and the two afferents send the same input spike train. But the second afferent is a bit delayed. So you have a temporal delay D. So it sends also 3 spikes as well, but a bit later, each spike. And I'm not going to go through the math, but you understand easily that if D is larger than a certain value, the neuron will receive only asynchronous spikes, and it will not reach its threshold, so it will not fire. But if D is small enough, then the neuron will receive 3 pairs of synchronous spikes, so it will fire 3 times. So you see here that D has a major impact on the postsynaptic activity, which is not captured by a rate-based model such as an artificial neural networks. Because if I'm just interested in the firing rate of the afferents, if I consider that the total duration here is 1 second, it would mean that both afferents fire at 3 Hertz. So a rate model would predict the same output, whatever D. But you see that D has a major impact on the postsynaptic activity. So if D is too small, if D is small enough, you have 3 Hertz in output. If D is too large, you have 0 in output. So what's happening here? Well, it's just that the assumption I told you about, which is that those guys fire independently to adopt this formalism, is violated in my simple example here, because I introduced some tendency of the afferent to fire together. And the thing is, in the brain, each time we record multiple neurons simultaneously, we do notice that there is a tendency for the neurons to fire together. So I think the assumption of independence is largely violated in the brain. And for this reason, for brain modeling, I prefer to use spiking neural networks. Okay, so I think I've convinced you, or I've tried to convince you that SNNs are important tool for neuroscience, because unlike the artificial neural networks, they can capture coincidence detection. They can also capture the dynamics of the responses, not only the steady regimes. And they can capture also fast processing, where you have maybe just 1 spike per neuron, and then a rate-based description of the activity is not very useful. I think spiking neural networks are also appealing for AI, because they have, at least in theory, they have more computational and representational power than SNNs, because there is an extra dimension, the time, which can be handled in a continuous way. So basically, in classic deep learning, we used with static activation patterns, and we deal with spike trains, which can evolve in continuous time. Of course, it's particularly appealing to use spiking neural networks if the input is also dynamic, like sounds or videos. You can use spiking neural networks for static images like ImageNet if you like, but it's more interesting if the stimulus is dynamic, because then you have an interaction between the dynamics of the stimuli and the dynamics of the network, and that can be very rich. And if you want to leverage spiking neural networks, you can simulate spiking neural networks on GPUs. But if you really want to leverage their advantage, it's better to run them on dedicated neuromorphic chips. So, for instance, IBM True North or Intel Low-E. And those chips, they leverage event-driven computation. So basically, the main philosophy is each time a neuron fire, you're going to update the potential of the neurons to which this particular neuron is connected, but only those neurons are attached. The other neurons are not modified. And if the neuron do not spike, you have nothing to do. So this strategy is especially appealing if spikes are rare. If you have few spikes, and that is true in the brain, and if connectivity is sparse. So if every neuron is connected to every neuron, then it's not very efficient. But if each neuron the probability of connection between a pair of neurons is low, then each time a neuron fires, you have very few updates to make, and then it's efficient to do computation this way. And you see that the philosophy is different from GPUs. GPUs are optimized to perform synchronous dense tensor products. And it doesn't matter if those products, so you multiply a product or a tensor of activations with a tensor of weights, and it doesn't matter if those tensor contains many zeros, the computation is done anyway. So sparsity is not leveraged on GPUs, and it is in the neuromorphic chips. Okay, so now the question is how to train those spiking neural networks. And I'm going to explain you a recent method that in a nutshell, it's a way to reconcile backpropagation with spiking neural networks, because until a few years ago, it was considered impossible to use backpropagation in spiking neural networks. I will explain you why. And now it is, thanks to a hack, if you like. So in a nutshell, we are going to discretize the time and to train the spiking neural network with backprop through time. So we need to discretize the time, which is one of the main disadvantages of the approach. At each time step, we're going to check if the threshold is reached, and this causes optimization issues. I will go back to that, and the workaround is to use a surrogate gradient. In practice, it means we can train spiking neural networks using automatic differentiation, for instance, in PyTorch or TensorFlow. Okay, so actually, the method can work with any spiking neuron model defined by a differential equation. So for simplicity here, I'm going to focus on the simplest spiking neuron model that exists, which is called the leaky integrate and fire neuron. So the differential equation is the following. We have tau, a time constant, times the derivative of the potential equals minus the potential. So this is the leakage term, which in the absence of inputs, it causes an exponential decay towards 0. And we have here the input current. And the input current is made of input spikes, and the input spikes are modeled as Dirac delta functions that you see here in the second line. So another way to say exactly the same thing is that each time you have an input spike, the potential jumps instantaneously by an amount which corresponds to the synaptic weight of the synapse through which the spike arrived. And in the absence of input spike, you just have the exponential decay towards 0. So this is the most simple spiking neuron model. You can have more fancy models. You can have non-instantaneous synapses where the jump is not instantaneous, but it takes some time. But for simplicity, I will focus on this model here. And then if the threshold is reached, then an output spike is emitted, and the potential goes back to 0. So what we are going to do, so those are the equations in continuous time. We are going to discretize them. So basically, we use the forward Euler method to integrate the differential equation, and then the main equation is a recurrent equation where the potential at time step n+1 is equal to the potential at time step n multiplied by beta, where beta is the leak coefficient. It's equal exponential minus the time step over the time constant. And plus, you have to include the contribution of all the spikes that arrived in the time bin. So each spike will cause a jump of potential whose magnitude is the synaptic weight. So you just weight the input spikes by the synaptic weights. Sj in n here is a binary tensor of the input spike. So it contains 1 if a spike arrived through synapse j at time step n and 0 otherwise. What you need to do also is that each time step, you need to check if the threshold is reached. And if it is reached, you emit an output spike. And if not, you don't. So this is done using the heaviside step function with the argument is v minus the threshold. So why I use the heaviside step function and not an if then else? I could do if potential is more than threshold, then emit a spike, otherwise don't. But I want to write everything in terms of mathematical equations. Why? Because then the auto differentiation will propagate the gradient through all those steps. And this is why I write everything in terms of mathematical equations. And if I have a spike emitted here, I need to do the reset. So what I need to do is I need to multiply the potential by 1 minus S out, where S out is the output spike. So if S out is 0, I have no output spike, the potential is unchanged. But if I have an output spike, it's multiplied by 0, so the potential goes back to 0. So this is a recurrent equation, so it should make you think of recurrent neural networks. And you know that recurrent neural networks, you can train them using backprop through time. And this is exactly what we do. So backprop through time is a process that goes in 2 steps. The first step is to enroll the network, the recurrent network, to get a feed-forward network. And once the network is feed-forward, you can train it with backprop. This is a simple example where I have a neuron, spiking neuron network with 2 layers, layer 1 and 2. And here you see the time steps on the x-axis. And you see that the spikes that arrive in the input layer at time step 0 are going to impact the potential of the neurons in the first layer at the subsequent time step. Because in this example, the propagation takes 1 time step. Sometimes we can use instantaneous propagation, but here it's 1 time step. So this is the W arrow, because it's going to weight the input spikes by weight matrix W. The beta here is the leakage coefficient. So from 1 time step to another, the potential is multiplied by beta. The theta here is the heavy step function. So if the potential is more than threshold, we emit a spike here. Otherwise, we don't. And if we emit a spike, it's going to influence the potential in the next layer at the next time step. And it's also going to reset the potential of the neurons that fire. So here, once you can enroll this network, and it becomes a feed-forward network that you can train with normal backprop. However, there is a problem here, which is that this theta, it's the heaviside step function, and the problem is the derivative of the heaviside step function is 0 almost everywhere. Only in 0, it's infinite. So it's like a Dirac delta function, if you like. So this is not, you cannot do backprop with that, because it would mean that the gradient is either 0 or infinite, and you cannot use these gradients to learn the weights. So what we do is a trick that is called surrogate gradient learning, and that was proposed by colleagues in 2019. In the forward pass, we do use the heaviside step function, but in the backward pass, it's like we pretend that a sigmoid was used in the forward pass. So instead of the Dirac delta function, we take the derivative of a sigmoid in the backward pass, and we use that for the gradient. So it's clearly an approximation, because it's not the true gradient, but in practice, it's very useful, and it allows to train a spiking neural network with backprop. So basically, it has a number of advantages. It is backprop, so it solves the spatial and temporal credit assignment problem. We can handle deep networks, both dense and convolutional layers. We can train not only the synaptic weights, but also the delays. I'll come back to that in the second part of my talk, or the time constant of the neurons. We can use analog inputs in the first layer if, for instance, we process images. This is not an issue. Okay, this I'm going to skip. Okay, and in practice, as I told you already, it means we can now train spiking neural networks in PyTorch. Of course, there are disadvantages. The first one is that we use discrete time. It's the most major disadvantage, in my opinion. Also, we cannot have many time steps because the cost is quadratic with the number of time steps. So this is an issue. We do not leverage the sparsity of the tensors because we use the GPUs for training. Now, for now, my philosophy is more we can train on GPUs, and once we have a trained network, we can implement it on a neuromorphic chip to leverage the advantages of spiking neural networks, but just at inference time. it's not very hardware friendly. It would be difficult to do this training on a neuromorphic chip itself. This is why for now we use the GPU, and it's not the way the brain learns. Okay, but due to this major breakthrough, the number of SNN papers has been exploding recently. It's not only due to this breakthrough, but I think it explains part of it, and including in AI conferences. In AI conferences, the number of sparking neural network papers at NeurIPS and CVPR and everything has been increasing strongly recently. In practice, I use a library, a PyTorch open source library that is called Spiking Jelly, to which I contributed, and which provides an efficient implementation of the SGL method. Okay, so that's all I wanted to do for the first part of my talk. Now I'm going to talk more specifically about my own research, and I'm going what I'm going to explain now is how backprop can be used to learn not only the synaptic weights, but the synaptic delays, using a new method that is called dilated convolution with learnable spacings. So the first thing I want to do is to thank my co-authors, Ismail, who did his PhD with me, but who is now graduated about a year ago and is now postdoc in Germany. Ilyas, who is a PhD student at Cerco with me, and Mohamed, who is a master student at University of Tehran. First, the outline of my talk will be the following. First, I will explain why we want to do delay learning. Then I will explain the method for fully connected layers and for conv layers. Okay. So this I already explained in the introduction, so I don't need to explain. Neurons, I think the main function of neurons is to perform coincidence detection. But it's important to understand that what should be synchronous to trigger an output spike is the spike arrival times, and not necessarily the spike emitting times. The arrival times should be synchronous, and why those times? And those times can be different between emission and reception because of delays. In the propagation in the brain and in neuromorphic chips is not instantaneous. It takes some time. And actually, this time, those delays can be leveraged for computations. This is a simple example by Izikevich in 2006. And you have three neurons, B, C, and D, that project towards two neurons, A and E, well, with heterogeneous delays. Each connection has a different delay here. Well, if B, C, and D fire at the same time, like here, A will receive asynchronous spikes, it will not fire. E will also receive asynchronous spikes, it will not fire. But if D, C, and B, if D fires first, then C, then B, like here, then A will receive three synchronous spikes, sorry. So it will reach its threshold, it will fire, and E will not. Conversely, if B fires first, then C, then D, like here, then A will not fire, but E will. Okay, so thanks to delays, the neurons can detect arbitrary spatiotemporal spike patterns, not just synchrony patterns. So it makes the computations more interesting. More formally, it's been shown in a theoretical paper using the VC dimension by Maas and Schmidt that adding trainable delays strongly increase the expressivity in spiking neural networks. And more generally, we know that in dynamical system theory, we know that if we add delays to dynamical systems, it strongly enriches the dynamics of its repertoire. So delays are interesting. How about in the brain? In the brain, there is evidence that the delays are plastic, because we have something that is called the myelin that makes conduction faster. So here is an example, an axon without myelin, the conduction is quite slow, but if you have some myelin, the electric signal jumps from one node to another, and so it propagates faster. So the more myelin you have, the faster the conduction and the lower the delay. And the range of possible delays is quite big, because for very fast connections it can be maybe down to 1 millisecond, but for slow connections without myelin it can be tens of milliseconds. So it's a big range of delays, and those delays are not fixed. They are plastic, and we know that if we learn some task, we see some changes in the myelin, in the brain regions that are involved in this task. So it seems to be necessary for learning. And also, if we block myelin production, this can be done in animals, in rats, for instance. The rats cannot learn some new task. So it seems to be causally involved in the learning process. So I think this is really cool, because when we think of learning in the brain or even in AI, most people think of weight plasticity. It's certainly part of learning, but maybe it's not the only thing. Maybe delay plasticity is as important, and it is much less studied. Also, I already told you about the neuromorphic chips in the introduction. Most of them have programmable delays. This can be the delays can be implemented using queues or ring buffers. This is the case, for instance, for Intel OE, IBM True North, Spinnaker, Seneca. And we have also some analog chips that use the circuit physics to implement delays. This is the case for brain scales or DNAPs, for instance. So all of this motivated us and others to learn delays in sparking neural networks. So our delay learning approach, in a nutshell, first, in terms of scope, we are going to limit ourselves to feed-forward sparking neural networks in discrete time. We are going to handle both fully connected and convolutional layers. And for now, as I told you, the philosophy is more to do offline learning on GPUs. And once we have a good network, we can implement it on a neuromorphic chip. Our main idea is to simulate delays using temporal convolutions, and I will come back to that. And then we are going to use a method that is called DCLS, Dilated Convolution with Learnable Spaces, to learn both the synaptic delays and the synaptic weights at the same time. And we only use this method at training time. At inference time, we don't. Training itself is done using the surrogate gradient learning approach that I told you in the introduction. So that is backprop through time with a surrogate gradient. And in practice, we use the Sparking Jelly library. Okay, maybe this I can skip because okay, I'm going to skip this method. We focus on synaptic delays. So I'm going to explain the method for fully connected layers. So here is the most important slide of the talk. It's a bit dense. On the right, you see a simple example where you have a neuron that has two afferents. Both afferents send some spikes. So you have a spike train S1 and S2. And each connection here has a weight, W1 and W2, and a delay, D1 and D2. And on the left, what you see is general equations. So in general, when you have a fully connected layer L, it can be parameterized by two matrices. The first one is a weight matrix, whose coefficient Wij are real numbers. And the second one is a delay matrix. So you have one delay per connection. So it's Dij, and those delays are, recall that we work in discrete time. So the delays are expressed as number of time steps. So they are positive integers. So when we want to compute the input current for the neuron I in layer L, we just use a weighted sum of the spikes emitted by the preceding layer. But we don't take the spikes that were emitted at the current time step, but the spikes that were emitted before in the past to implement the delay. So you see here that a delay of 0 if dij equals 0, we take the spikes that have just been emitted at this current time step. But if we increase the delay, we go further in the past to get the spike. Well, our main idea is to rewrite this as a convolution, or more correctly, mathematically speaking, as a cross correlation between a certain kernel and the spike train of the preceding layer. And this kernel is quite sparse. It contains only one non-zero coefficient. This is clear because here we use a Kronecker delta in this formulation. And so the total input current can be rewritten as a cross correlation between very sparse kernels, only one non-zero element, and the spike train of the preceding layer. And actually, this is done using a single, this total sum is done using a single call to PyTorch conv1d function. So it's very well parallelized. And what you see here is that the kernel contains mostly zeros and only one non-zero element, which corresponds to the synaptic weight. And this non-zero element is placed at a position which corresponds to the delay. So we use a PyTorch convention. So PyTorch uses, when you call convolution, it's actually, it should be called cross correlation. So the only difference is that the kernel in the convolution is flipped and it's not in PyTorch. So using PyTorch convention, it means that the delay 0 corresponds to the rightmost position. And the more you increase the delay, the more you put the non-zero coefficient on the left part of the kernel. Okay, so that is the solution for. So at this point, you may think, okay, but it's a very stupid way to implement the delay, because you do a lot when you do this cross correlation. You do a lot of many multiplications by 0, which may seem as a waste of resources. And you're totally right. We do a lot of multiplication by 0, but in practice it's not an issue, because as I told you, the convolution is very is well parallelized on the GPUs by PyTorch, and it's very fast. And recall that we only do that at training time. At inference time, we can implement the delays more classically. As I told you, it's done using ring buffers or delay queues. But at training time, we do the convolutions with many zeros. Okay, so I told you how we handle, I told you that the delays are integers, positive integers, but to learn them with backpropagation, we need to relax the integer constraint at training time, because gradient descent works with real numbers. So basically what we need is a method to construct a kernel for a non-integer delay. And this method should be differentiable so that delays have well-defined gradients. And dilated convolution with learnable spacings is all you need for this. So DCLS is actually a generic method that can be used in non-spiking artificial neural networks as well. But for the purpose of this talk, I will focus on how the method can be used to learn delays in spiking neural networks. After learning, we can round the delays to the nearest integers, and DCLS is no longer needed. So DCLS uses an interpolation method to build a kernel for a non-integer delay. So there are two available methods in the library: linear interpolation and Gaussian interpolation. So let me explain linear first. So if the delay happens to be an integer, then it's easy. You just put the weight on this particular integer and 0 everywhere else. But in the general case, the delay will be a real number. So it will fall between two integers like here. Well, what we do is we're going to spread the weight on the two nearest kernel elements pro rata to the distances. So if the delay is closer to this element, we put most of the weight here. and the remaining part of the weight on the other integer position. So this is one way to do it, to do the interpolation. Another way is the Gaussian interpolation, where what we are going to do is we are going to center a Gaussian on the real valued delay, like here, and to and for the kernel, we are going to use the values of this Gaussian for the integer positions. So here you see that most of the weight is here. You have a little bit of weight here, but technically none of the weights are exactly zero because the Gaussian is non-zero everywhere. So and this is the difference between the two things, because this kernel is sparser because here it's exactly zeros, and with the Gaussian it's not. If we use the Gaussian interpolation, we can use an additional trick, which is to progressively reduce the width of the Gaussian during learning. So at the beginning of learning, we use, here you see the kernels for 8 afferents of a given neuron. You see the real valued delay in red. You have the time on the x-axis. And at the beginning of learning, we use Gaussian with a quite wide sigma. And progressively we reduce it. So at the end of learning, we have Gaussians that are very narrow. And most of the time, the kernel only contains one coefficient, which is significantly above zero, like here. In some cases, no, because here, for instance, this delay is exactly between two integers. So then you have significant weights on both sides. And at the end, we need an integer delay. So we need to round the delay. So the weight will go only to one position. And this creates a little bit of discrepancy here. So this rounding step can cause a loss of accuracy. So if we lose accuracy, what we can do is to do a couple of more epochs where we keep the delays fixed and we train only the weights. But in practice, it's not a big issue. So we trained the first thing we tried, the first experiment we tried is to use this idea on a very simple network for sound classification. So the architecture we used is very, very simple. We use only a layer with a fully connected spiking neural network with 2 or 3 hidden layers. We use vanilla leaf neurons, so the most simple spiking neuron model you can think of. And between each neurons, we had 1 or 2 synapses with a weight and a delay. I didn't explain that, but we can implement more than 1 synapse per pair of synapses. That boils down to having more than 1 non-zero coefficient in the kernel before interpolation. So I'm not going to. So we tried that on 3 audio data sets. The first ones are spiking, the spiking Heidelberg dataset and the spiking speech command, and the bottom one is non-spiking Google speech command dataset. So I'm not going to describe too much this slide because this was the state of the art at the time of publishing 1 year ago, but I will show you a more recent state of the art at the end. But in short, we outperformed the previous state of the art with fewer parameters. Now the question, so we reached a very good accuracy. So now the question is this accuracy really due to the trainable delays? So to make sure we performed an ablation study. So I'm going to describe first this plot on the right, and I'm going to where we imposed a certain level of sparsity in the connectivity matrices to make the task harder and to see better the differences between conditions. So I'm going to describe from right to left the different bars. So the first one is a yellow bar here, is a network without delays. So the accuracy is quite poor on both data sets. The red bar is if you add random fixed delays, so not trainable, but you add some random delays. It actually helps a lot in terms of accuracy. But if we learn the delays, that's the green bar, we get an additional boost of accuracy. And I argue that this is the good control, right? Because many delay learning papers compared their result with a network without delays. But no, to prove that your delay learning algorithm is useful, you have to show that it does better than random delays, not that it does better than no delays. So our algorithm does better than random delays. And the green bar was with constant sigma. We use the Gaussian interpolation in this experiment. And if we do the additional trick of decreasing sigma, we get a small increase of accuracy. So this trick helps a little bit. On the left plot, we have the same without imposing sparsity in the connectivity matrix, so the accuracies are better. And yeah, the last thing I didn't describe are the blue bars. The blue bars is something that we did for fun, is a network where we don't learn the weights at all. We learn only the delays. And you see that in this case of dense connectivity, we can already get a decent accuracy without learning the weights. So I think it's really, really interesting, but still, of course, it's preferable to learn both the weights and the delays. Okay, that was the method for fully connected layers. For convolutional layers, let me explain the method for convolutional layers. For illustration purposes, I focus on the 2D case. So you may think of a network that does vision, computer vision, for instance. And I just illustrate the case where I have one input channel and one output channel for simplicity, but it can be generalized. It's trivial to generalize to multi-channels. So what is a convolutional layer? A convolutional layer is a layer that leverages two things. First thing is the idea of a restricted receptive field. So this guy in this map is not connected to everyone in the preceding map, but just to neurons in a certain spatial neighborhood, which is called the spatial receptive field. And the second thing is weight sharing. So this guy here uses the same, so this connection here has the same synaptic weight as this connection here. And so they are not learned independently, they are shared. And what we're going to share the delay as well, because we think it makes no sense to share the weights if you don't share the delays. Both should be shared or unshared. So we're going to share the delays as well. So if I write the input current for neurons in this layer, it's again the weighted sum of the spikes emitted by the neurons in the preceding layer in the certain spatial receptive field, and at a time which corresponds to the delay. So we have a delay for each connection. And our idea is again to rewrite this as a convolution or as a cross correlation between the spike train of the preceding layer and a 3D kernel, where this kernel is quite sparse. So it's 3D because it was 1D in the fully connected layers, but now we have two spatial additional dimension. So it's 3D in total. We have two spatial dimension and one temporal one. And for each row ij, there is only one non-zero element, W, whose position corresponds to the delay. So here, this is clearer on this figure. We have a 3D kernel. So for in each row ij, we have a single, if the delay is an integer, we have a single non-zero element whose position corresponds to the delay. Again, we use the PyTorch convention. So delay 0 is the rightmost position. But in the general case, if the delay is not an integer, we need again a method to handle non-integer delays. And this method is called DCS3-1D. Why 3-1D? Because it builds a 3D kernel, but interpolation is only done on the last dimension, on the temporal dimension here. So we use the same idea. Here we illustrate the linear interpolation. So because this delay is closer to this frame than to this frame, we put most of the weight here and the remaining part here. We can also use the Gaussian interpolation. I did not illustrate it, but it's available. Okay, maybe this I will skip because I see that time is flying. So we tried on this approach on two data sets. The first one is a vision data set, but we wanted to a vision task which is temporal, meaning that can't be solved using spatial features only. So we thought of lip reading. So lip reading is a task where a person is filmed pronouncing a word, and you have to guess which word was pronounced using only the images. It's a challenging task because the current state of the art has room for improvement. In practice, we use the dataset that is called DVS lip. So the person was filmed by a spiking camera, and those spikes were fed to a spiking CNN backbone. This was a 2D convolutional spiking neural network inspired by spiking ResNet. And then after this backbone, those spikes were fed to a head, which in this particular architecture, it was a spiking version of the gated recurrent unit, but I'm not going to describe it. Because we did not touch the head, what we did is we added some delays in the convolutional backbone by replacing the conv2Ds by DCLS3 1D. And we also used another similar architecture proposed by Bulzomi, which is very similar, only that it does not use spike GRU. It only uses vanilla leak integrate and fire neurons in the head. But again, we only modified the backbones by adding some delays. And basically, so this is a work in progress. It's not published yet, but basically adding trainable delays in the backbone help, even with a GRU-based head. So this came as a surprise because GRUs are very good at extracting, turning temporal dependencies. But even with GRUs, it helps to add trainable delays in the backbone. Again, we verified that our learning algorithm does better than non-learnable random delays. Then we went back to an audio classification task, and for this task we did not use a published architecture. We designed our own architecture. It's inspired by ConvNext. The block, you see the block here on the left, it's inspired from ConvNext with an inverted bottleneck. The most important part of the block is this DCLS2 1D layer. So why DCLS2 1D? Because with respect to the vision task, we have one fewer dimension. Before we had X, Y, and time. Now we just have the frequency because it's an audio spectrogram, the input, and the time. So we use DCLS2 1D, where the interpolation is done on the temporal dimension. And here you see the frequential dimension. We didn't use skip connection for simplicity. And maybe when you see this block, you think, okay, there are many non-spiking layers here. Only the leaf is a spiking layer. And that's true, but in my opinion, this is still a spiking neural network because after learning, batch norm can be absorbed in the preceding conv layer. And multiple conv layers can always be replaced by a single one. If there is no nonlinearity in between, multiple conv layers is still a linear operation with restricted receptive feed and weight sharing. So it's still a convolution. So basically, it could boil down to a network with only alternatively leaf and conv layers. And this, we know that it's a spiking neural network that can be implemented on an event-driven neuromorphic chip. So this is a comparison with up-to-date state-of-the-art on two audio datasets, the spiking Heidelberg dataset and the spiking speech command. So I know this slide is a bit dense, so let me walk you through it. So the first thing I want to tell you is that we are now the state-of-the-art on those two datasets, even though it's a work in progress, it's not published. And also, so those datasets are very temporal. So you need to a network that is able to learn temporal dependencies to solve them. And there are multiple strategies to learn those temporal dependencies. One is to use complex neuron models instead of the vanilla leaky integrate and fire neuron, which is the simplest. You can have more complex neuron models like the multi-compartmental model, for instance, and those are shown in purple. Or you can add recurrent connections. Those are shown in highlighted in blue, or you can add delays. And this is our strategy highlighted in yellow. But we are the only ones, to the best of my knowledge, to learn synaptic delays in convolutional layers. And by the way, on those datasets, we are not too far away from the ANN state of the art. So with non-spacking network, for instance, with a state space model, sorry, we can reach, people have reached 88.4. So on the SSC dataset, so we are not that far with 85.4. Okay, so in terms of discussion, okay, this is our main competitor, but I see that I'm a bit late, so maybe if you know it and if you have questions, I can compare with Slayer. This is another competitor. Again, I'm going to skip unless we can come back in the discussion. In terms of general discussion, I think I've showed you that learning delays really help, especially for temporal tasks, and especially if you impose some sparse connectivity, if you have few synapses. We found an efficient way to do it, leading to new state-of-the-art on vision and temporal, and some vision and audio datasets. And even if we used vanilla leaf neurons and without recurrent connections, there is probably room for improvement by using more fancy spacking neuron models or adding recurrent connections. We are the first method to learn synaptic delays in conv layers, as I told you. Of course, there are some limits. The main one, in my opinion, is that we use discrete time. However, this is common for all the approaches that use surrogate gradient learning that I explained in the introduction. This requires discrete time, so most of nearly all approaches now use surrogate gradient learning, so they use discrete time, except event prop, and maybe Delgrad. Those are the only, to the best of my knowledge, those are the only backprop approaches that can possibly work in continuous time. Another thing is that our choice to simulate delays using temporal convolutions requires to have the whole input time series before running the convolution. So it's restricted to offline training of feed-forward connections. So we know that delays bring some strong advantages in terms of accuracy. We also know that on neuromorphic hardware, they have a cost. So now one of the next step for me is to see if the advantages are worth the cost. Okay, that's it. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Timothée. Is there some question in the audience first? Well, I have some. You mentioned several times more fancy neural networks.
Like spacking neuron model, you mean?
Spacking neural models, sorry.
Well, okay.
Like I saw in your table, you had some adaptive neural networks. I wonder, yes. Because it was very popular 15 years ago, when Izikevich had his own spacking models. Do people use Izikevich model in SNN today for AI tasks?
Not many people. Not many people. It's still. I haven't seen any paper which showed a clear advantage of Izikevich neurons over leaf neurons, for instance. It's theoretical, but it brings a lot of additional complexity, the Izikevich model, and it's very sensitive to some hyperparameters. So it's not clear yet if there is a strong advantage. What seems to be clearer is this ADLIF model here, which is simpler than Izikevich. It's like intermediate between LIF and Izikevich. And basically, the idea is it implements some adaptation mechanism, which means that a neuron that has been active recently is less likely to fire a spike. You need more larger input to fire a neuron that has fired a lot recently. It's some sort of fatigue mechanism, if you like. Yeah. And adding this mechanism can bring some additional benefits. This is clear.
Okay, thank you. And another question, maybe on the same line. What you present is mostly feed-forward spiking neural networks.
That is true.
Are there some interest in recurrent activity of neural networks?
Yes. First, I should say that even though in terms of definition, I agree that in terms of definition in the spiking neural network literature, I consider that we use feed-forward SNNs because we don't have recurrent connections. But you have to know that spiking neural network is intrinsically recurrent because you have the equation of the potential that is a recurrent equation. And that is why we need the backprop through time, and not just backprop. We need to unroll the network because of this recurrent, which it's not a connection. It's not a connection. It's not weighted, but it's intrinsically recurrent. Now the question is for instance those networks in blue. They added, in addition to this internal recurrence, if you like, they added also recurrent connections with some weight. So you have a layer with recurrent connections between neurons. And this brings additional benefits as well. This is actually one of the strategies to tackle those data sets. One of the problem is it's costly in terms of number of parameters. And it makes training more difficult. Also, it's harder to converge. So
and they still use backprop.
They still use backprop through time. Yes, you can do that.
Okay.
I mean, it's possible to use backprop through time in networks in SNNs with recurrent connections. Okay. But I would argue, if you look at this table, you see that none of the papers used both recurrent connections and delays. So I don't know. It's something I would like to explore in the future, but maybe you only need one of them. And I would argue that delays are less costly than recurrent connections, but maybe this is debatable.
Okay. Also, I'm curious about the spiking datasets you mentioned. How are they spiking, and because it's sound datasets?
Okay, so yeah, I did not fully explain this. Okay, so in those two datasets, SHD and SSC are spiking, and what they did is they took some audio datasets and they converted them into spikes using a cochlear model. So this is what your cochlea is currently doing, is converting a sound into spikes. And yes. Here you see an example of spike trains. The x-axis is the time, the y-axis is the index of the cochlear cell, and each cochlear cell has a preferred frequency. Yeah. Okay, so it fires more for if the sound contains this frequency. So even if this is spiking, those are spike trains, but it's similar in spirit to a spectrogram because you can see the y-axis as a frequency because each cell has a preferred frequency, and the x-axis is the time. So this is similar to a spectrogram, but it's spiking in nature. It's not graded values.
Okay, and for the Google speech dataset, how did you manage to get a spiking
okay.
input?
So okay, good question. I did not explain that either. But the Google speech command is not spiking. So the entry is a spectrogram, which contains some graded values. I mean, some real numbers. So what I told you here is that this the surrogate gradient learning method can handle analog inputs, and indeed, if you look at this equation here, in the SJ in is usually spikes emitted by the previous layers, but for the first layer, it can be also analog values.
Okay.
It can be analog values. So actually, and if you do that, then the first layer of the network will learn how to convert the analog values into spikes. And then the rest of the network will process spikes only. But the first layer will do an analog to spike conversion and a learnable one. And if you think of it, it's actually also what your retina or what your cochlea are currently doing, right? Because if you think of the retina, for instance, the light is a continuous signal. It's an analog signal, and it's converted into spikes by your retinal ganglion cells. And this is what we can capture this in the first layer of the network, and then the rest of the network only processes spikes.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a last question before turning to Julio. Do people use properties of a membrane like oscillations or things like that in computation with spiking neural networks?
So there is a line of research that uses complex numbers with real part and imaginary part but it's fairly abstract, but it's to how to capture the oscillatory mechanisms in the brain, because indeed in the brain you have some oscillatory activities, and it's been shown that the spike times with respect to the phase of the underlying oscillations can carry information. So this is something that you can capture with a network that complexes complex numbers, and so each complex number has a rho and a theta, an angle and a modulus, and the modulus can be mapped to the firing rate of the neurons, and the theta can be mapped to the phase of those spikes with respect to the oscillation. So yes, it's an active field of research.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Julio, you had a question, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious about this. So we were talking about delays, and I was wondering if are there delays in the brain? So delay in the sense of after a spike, is there a necessary time after which there can be no spike from a neuron?
Yes.
And it doesn't make sense to eventually include this in a model.
Yes. Okay. Yes, you are totally right. You are totally right. In the brain, there is something that is called the refractory period, and if a neuron has just fired a spike, it cannot fire another one before the refractory period is over. Whatever the input, it is just too tired to fire another spike. So. And this is something we model implicitly in our network, because with this formalism in discrete time, we cannot have more than one spike per time step. We cannot emit more than one spike per time step, because at each time step we check if the threshold is reached, and then we process to the subsequent time step. So basically, the refractory period is at least one time step here. I mean, we have this hard refractory period of one time step, and in practice, the time steps size we use are more than 1 millisecond long, and the refractory period in the brain is the order of magnitude is 1 millisecond. So we do not need it's there already. We do not need to worry about that. But
so maybe the discrete time is a feature then.
That is true. If we worked in continuous time, we would have to worry about implementing the refractory period. Yes.
Keep going again with this parallelism with biology. Is there in the model, is the threshold of each neuron learned, and is there a different threshold in the neuron of the brain? If you
but well. I've seen some papers which learn the threshold. Usually we don't, because at least from a mathematical perspective, it makes no sense, because if you multiply all the weights by 2 and the thresholds by 2, you do not change the mathematical model. Okay.
Right.
But what matters is the ratio between the threshold and the weights. If the weights are stronger but the threshold is higher, it's exactly the same neuron model in the end. So because we learn the weights, I think we do not lose anything in fixing the threshold. We don't need to learn both. But I know that for some weird thing of gradient descent, some people claim that there is some benefits in learning both, but I'm a bit skeptical. At least it's not strong.
And I have other 2 questions. One is, I don't know much about these models, but I was wondering if they're somewhat related. I've heard about liquid neural networks. Do they make sense as a comparison, or with the spike neural networks, or I mean, I was expecting them to see among the competitors, but maybe I'm wrong. I was wondering if you know if it's something to comment about it.
I'm not an expert in liquid neural networks. I think they are non-spiking, so they don't. They still use graded activations. They are. I think they are more. The main idea is the time constant. They still use some form of leading integration, and the idea is that the time constant tau, the equivalent of our tau, is not fixed. It changes. It is input dependent. But because the time constant is liquid, it enriches the ability to learn temporal dependencies, and you can do a lot with few neurons in terms of learning temporal dependencies. This is what I know, but to me it's quite different because they don't use spikes.
Right. Thanks. And so, a very last question: have you ever heard about neuronal avalanches? It was the idea that in the brain, the signal, the chain of activation from one layer to another follows a branching process at a critical.
Criticality.
Yeah, I don't know. I was wondering, have you ever checked if you see this sort of feature emerging during the training of your models, or not? Just curious.
No, I didn't check that. I suspect to get those avalanches, you need recurrent connections. You probably need them, and this is not. We did not explore that yet, as I told you. But yeah, it would be an interesting future direction.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more questions? I don't see any hand raised. Okay, so thank you very much. It was very clear and very exciting. I think there will be more to come in this domain soon. So thank you very much. And,
okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Maybe Cyrano had a question?
One very last, but it's going to be very, very short. Is there any relation, or so before hearing about spiking neural networks, I heard a lot about spikegrams, especially in the audio domain, like basically somehow binarized spectrograms that are used for fingerprinting. Is there any something that resembles what you get out the cochlear model?
Okay.
And I think when you think of Shazam and things like this, it's like how they manage to get those very fast computations of hashing files and stuff. So do you see an advantage for this kind of architecture for such spikgrams?
Okay, I haven't heard of spikgrams specifically, but yeah, in general, even in vanilla deep learning, right, there is an active field of research which is quantization. So you can quantize the weights and the activations and also the inputs. And not only it makes and you can see a spiking neural network as an extreme version of that, because the activation are quantized to a binary signal, either active or non-active. But even in the ANN, even in the vanilla deep learning community, it's an active field of research, quantization, and even if you don't go until binarization, you can compress weights and activations and inputs on a few bits and without losing much accuracy, and you strongly decrease the computational cost, because it's much lighter to multiply integers, for instance, coded on 4 bits or 8 bits than floating point numbers. And sometimes this quantization can even help in terms of accuracy, because it can be seen as some form of regularization, and it can decrease the overfitting. So yeah, I'm not surprised that quantizing the inputs can also help with the spikgrams.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much again to all of you, and see you not next week, because we don't have seminar next week, but in 2 weeks. It will be about Bayesian neural networks. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.